Hello, boys and girls. Our story today is John Henry and his mighty hammer. Now, this is a story that we call a tall tale. Oftentimes in a tall tale, the character might be somewhat true, but people tell stories and the stories get bigger and bigger and bigger and more impossible to believe. So here we have this story about a famous legendary hero called John Henry. And here we have the title page, John Henry and His Mighty Hammer. Written by Patsy Jensen and illustrated by Roseanne Litzinger. And the publisher is Troll Associates. It says in the beginning of this book that John Henry in this story is a pretend person, but there may have been a real John Henry long ago. Some say he was born in Tennessee and died in 1870. And they say there really was a race between John Henry and a steam drill. A tall tale, boys and girls, is an unusual story that has been exaggerated as it is retold over and over and over again. If there was a real John Henry, he probably wasn't quite as strong as the stories tell. The important thing to remember, though, is the spirit of John Henry that tells us, I can do this job, and I can do it well. And here we have the story, the first picture. John Henry was the biggest, fastest, strongest steel driving man that ever lived. And there he is. You see the railroad tracks? He worked on those. Now, this is really funny when you look at this. Here we see him as a baby, and it says, people say that John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand, but that is not true. He did not pick up a hammer until he was 3 weeks old. People also say that right after John Henry was born, he said to his mom and daddy, I'm a steel driving man, and I will die with a hammer in my hand. But that is also not true. He actually said, I'm hungry. Now remember, these are pretend things. We know that no baby could be born with a hammer in his hand or talking that early. For John Henry's first meal, he ate 3 sides of beef, 3 pots of mashed potatoes, 50 ears of corn, and 10 apple pies for dessert. Not bad for a 10-minute-old baby. There's all that food. When he was 4 weeks old, John Henry started swinging his daddy's hammer against some rocks. I'm a steel driving man, he said, and I will die with a hammer in my hand. And there you see him with his hammer. John Henry's mama frowned at his words. I don't want you to be a steel driving man, she said. You had better find something else to do. And so John Henry stopped swinging his daddy's hammer. But John Henry did not stop growing. He grew and grew, and then he grew some more. When he got older, John Henry did lots of things. He picked cotton and tobacco. He loaded crates and barrels onto ships. He was a mule driver. But John Henry never felt as good as he did with a hammer in his hand. And here he is, working. One day, John Henry saw a beautiful young woman. Her name was Polly Ann. She and John Henry took a liking to each other, and soon they got married. "There is something I must tell you," he said to Polly Ann after their wedding. "I'm a steel driving man, and I will die with a hammer in my hand." Polly Ann didn't say a word. She knew that John Henry would not be happy unless he was swinging a hammer. John Henry and Polly Ann headed to West Virginia, where railroads were being built. "There's work to be done," said John Henry, "and I'm just the steel driving man to do it." Sure enough, they soon heard the sound of hammers ringing against steel. The wagon headed around one last bend, and John Henry was greeted with a beautiful sight. And here you see the railroad tracks being built. There in the valley below were hundreds of men, hammering and singing. They were building the Big Bend Tunnel for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. The tunnel was going to go right through a big mountain. John Henry headed right over to the boss. His name was Captain Tommy. "Captain," said John Henry, "I am here to drive steel for you." Captain Tommy only had to take one look at John Henry to see that he was the biggest, strongest, fastest steel driving man around. Of course, John Henry did not use a 10-pound hammer like the other men. His hammer weighed 30 pounds, and no other man could swing it. But one woman could swing it. Every now and then when John Henry came down with a cold, Polly Ann would take his place, and it was said that she drove steel almost as fast as John Henry. And here's his wife, Polly Ann, and she's got his big hammer. One day a man in fancy clothes came to the railroad camp. He brought a strange machine. "This is a steam drill," he told Captain Tommy. "It can outdrill 5 men in half the time." Captain Tommy just laughed. "I do not need 5 men to beat your machine. I have 1 man who can do it." The 2 men made a bet. Who would drill faster, the steam drill or John Henry? And the machine is back here. "No machine can beat a steel driving man," said John Henry. "I will prove it." The man turned on the steam drill. John Henry picked up his great hammer, and the race began. Hour after hour, the steam drill kept going. So did John Henry. "Who is winning?" John Henry finally asked. "It's about even," said Captain Tommy. "No machine can even tie a steel driving man," said John Henry. He picked up a second 30-pound hammer. He began swinging both hammers with all his might. Finally, the judge blew the whistle. The race was over, and John Henry was the winner. Can you see both? He's got one hammer over here in that hand and one over here. John Henry smiled as the railroad workers cheered. Then he laid down with a hammer in his hand. "I am tired," said John Henry, "but I beat the machine, just like I said I would." Then he closed his eyes and died. Polly Ann buried John Henry near the Big Bend Tunnel, and she buried him with a hammer in his hand. And so, boys and girls, that's the legend of John Henry. It's a legend, it's a tall tale. We don't really know how much truth there is about John Henry, but we do know that all these stories that people tell are made up and made bigger and bigger and bigger as people tell them all the time. It's like the person who goes fishing and comes home and tells his mama, "I caught a fish this big today." And the fish was only about this big. That's an exaggeration. Well, in tall tales, there are a lot of exaggerations. So, look around for some that you might find. Write one of your own. That would be fun. Write a story and have you as the main character and have it be a tall tale. Okay, I'll see you in our next storybook.